Joining me now, retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He's a former combat veteran of Desert Storm and the war in Afghanistan. He is also the host of his own YouTube show, Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Colonel Davis, thank you so much for being here. And so the challenge of conducting this urban warfare, A, to get hostages back, and B, to then level Gaza and potentially just engage in the hand-to-hand combat it's going to take on mission A, it can't be, the complexity of it can't be overstated.
Boy, you hit the nail right on the head. You cannot overstate how hard this is going to be for so many reasons. And really at the top of that list is that Hamas has clearly shown that they don't care about life. They don't care about their own life. And that's actually a dangerous situation because they're willing to take a lot of risk with that. And so that also implies that whenever Israel or if the U.S. Special Forces ever get involved with this, the risk is going to be very, very high for the hostages as well as for those trying to get them out. And even if you're talking about a conventional fight like this, you got to know that as prepared as Hamas was to launch this operation, they also had equal preparation for the expected Israeli defense. And they have had many years to understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures Israel uses when they come in. So they have probably defenses already constructed and are waiting for Israel, which probably will include, booby traps, actually what they call fire bags, where they'll try to draw them in and draw them into certain areas where they can then have pre-planned bombs or snipers. This is going to be hard in every capacity.
I mean, there's no way that the Israelis don't know all of that, and yet they want to get their hostages back. I mean, these are women, they're children, they're babies, like they're fellow Defense Force members. But, what country would leave its women and its children and its elderly citizens just aside and say, oh, well, they got him. I guess they're as good as dead anyway. Israel's not going to do that. So will it not require a ground force invasion or incursion into Gaza?
Well, here's the situation. One of the most famous hostage situations was the raid at Entebbe many years ago in Uganda that Israel launched. And, that's a very complex issue. And then you try to get the hostages out. And that's when it's really easy to identify. This time, Hamas almost certainly has spread however many of these hostages there are throughout the Gaza Strip and all these different locations. And they almost certainly have visibility on the routes that would come in. So they would know if the Hamas or if the Israeli side is coming to get them, if they want to try a covert situation. So it's going to be really hard in any case. And there's no question that if they get it cornered, I think we can expect that Hamas would kill those hostages. And if Israel goes in and tries several of them and they start backfiring, then that's going to cause a lot of backlash within especially the family members in Israel. So again, there is no easy path to this. Every way that you would suggest has a big negative side on it. And honestly, I'm not real sure what Israel is going to do and how they're going to try to get these back short of negotiations.
I mean, there's a report out today, just looking it up here, via the Wall Street Journal, that Israel may be exploring a possible deal to secure at least the release of women and children using Egypt as an intermediary. This is according to Egyptian officials. But Hamas has given little indication, quoting from the report here in Wall Street Journal again, that it is prepared to negotiate unless it can secure the release of thousands of Palestinians in Israeli detention, according to these officials. Either way, they're saying this is a lose-lose because, you exchange thousands of Palestinian prisoners for one or two, a small handful of Israeli prisoners. That's obviously a propaganda victory for Hamas. But if you send the Israelis into Gaza, boots on the ground, you're going to suffer a huge loss of life on the Israeli side. And there's no guarantee you're ever getting those hostages back, even so.
That's exactly right. And that just underscores the conundrum even for the government of Israel, because, you can imagine the backlash they would get if they, even if they got the women and children out. That would be, obviously great for every reason you can imagine. But then if it resulted in more experienced and hardcore Hamas fighters getting returned back into the potential battlefield to continue fighting, that's going to be bad for Israel. And that's a definitely lose-lose situation. Bottom line is that the operation that Hamas launched here has put the Israeli government in a horrible situation at the beginning, and it remains that case right now. At some point, though, because Netanyahu has said their declared position is that they will destroy Hamas, he's going to have to go in at some point. Otherwise, all they're doing is, guarding the fence, and they can't get by with that with the casualties that have already been launched into. So there's just no good path for Israel to take. Every path they go on has really big negatives. And unfortunately, they're going to have to choose some negative at some point to get this resolved.
What does it mean for us and for Hamas that they've managed to involve Americans? That they have, some number of American hostages now. In fact, the families of some of them actually just held a press conference. Hold on, let me just pull some of the facts from it. They just held a press conference today. The family of at least 4 Americans spoke. One hostage taken is a 66-year-old California-born mother. She's a hostage. The family said that they expect to have their family member back home safe and sound. They said they've had zero communication from Israel or the U.S. government. There's another man, Ruby Chen, said his son is an Israeli soldier. He's asking the United States not to take a back seat, says no formal attempt by the U.S. government to update the families of the missing Americans yet. And then there's Jonathan Deckel Chen spoke. His son is missing, appealed to U.S. leaders to do what they can on the side of good. So we're starting to get some information about who was taken, but they took Americans. I've spent years talking to our most well-known and beloved veterans and soldiers. Guys like Marcus Luttrell, guys like Dakota Meyer, Medal of Honor winner, where we don't leave men behind. We don't. And those are even murdered, assassinated, dead soldiers. We don't leave them behind. We go in, we risk our soldiers' lives to get them. These are live Americans who are civilians who are taken. So what does that do for us in our calculation here?
Yeah, you're right. It is an article of faith. We don't leave anyone behind. That's drilled into us from day one, and it's part of our DNA. I think out of Americans, not only just military, we just don't leave people behind because that's who we are. And I suspect that Hamas did not plan on capturing Americans because I don't think that they really want the heat that we can bring to bear added on top of what they are already planning to do. And this puts them in a bit of a conundrum because if they start killing American hostages, that may look good on the surface of it for their cause, for what they're trying to get done. But the heat that will bring for us, because I think then you might see some direct American involvement in the event that Americans are killed by Hamas. I just can't imagine that we would stay out. And I think that they don't want us adding in there because that'll just add to their difficulty. So let's hope that reasonable fear on their part might prevent them from killing any Americans and release those hostages.
Do you feel, on the other hand, we don't want a full-fledged war in the Middle East that we didn't have 4 days ago, right? So that will lead to the death of a whole lot more of Americans. So we have to be smart about how we get involved and what we do. There's some report that we're sending some Navy SEALs over there right now. This seems like a mission for our best and brightest and most talented to somehow get in there. But as I'm saying it, I'm thinking about what you just said. They probably rehearsed for months for somebody trying to come in, get into these so-called terror tunnels that are underground, get onto these streets that they've got eyes on. Our Navy SEALs are still human.
Right. No, believe me, I am a strong advocate of not expanding this war any. In fact, I've been arguing from the minute we've heard about this, we've got to contain it within the Gaza Strip. We can't even allow it to get into the West Bank, or God forbid if it gets into Lebanon or Iran, because then that would be catastrophic for everybody, and most assuredly our interests as well. We cannot afford to get into another war no matter what. But what I was suggesting is that there could come a time when there could be some targeted operations, whether that's drones, whether that's intelligence, or perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, like you say, some specific special forces. But honestly, I don't think that would be necessary because Israel has great special forces themselves. And although they were caught off guard by this, they're going to recover because they have the capacity to do that. And if this takes a long time, and especially once they get the hostage issue resolved, the future is not good for Hamas. I don't see a path to victory for them. Even if they got all the hostages given away and they got all the 5,000 that they wanted, they still can't win a long-term war. And all they can do is die slowly as long as we keep this thing contained. You were so right on that. That's critical for our needs.
What we're doing right now, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, made a statement yesterday. We will supply Israel with munitions, military equipment. U.S. CENTCOM began moving the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to the Eastern Mediterranean, which includes, as we mentioned earlier in the show, an aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, That's the world's largest aircraft carrier and the largest warship ever constructed. A Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. We've also taken steps, said Austin, to augment U.S. Air Force F-35s, F-15, F-16, A-10 fighter aircraft squadrons in the region. Can you translate that? Missile cruisers, missile destroyers, fighter aircraft squadrons going near the... Translate that for us civilians.
Yeah. What you really have is that the primary focus is the Gerald R. Ford, because that's how we project power. You go up to 500 miles to project, combat power from the decks of that ship. But you can't just send an aircraft carrier out there by itself. You've got to have lots of support. So a lot of those Arleigh Burke missile carriers are actually designed for air defense to make sure that missiles can't come and attack our ships from any source, wherever they may come from. Now, those ships I don't think have anything to do with what's happening in the Gaza Strip. Israel can handle all of it. We've been giving them $3.8 billion a year to help their defense, for many, many years. And they have a good, solid capability and technological and manpower pool. I think that, though, is more of a warning to the region saying, do not expand this. It's to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Don't start messing with Israel because we have their back. And certainly to Iran, don't take any action here because we're in the area. We've got firepower. I think that's the primary purpose of those flotilla.
Let me run this by you. A former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, in an interview with The Atlantic. Some disturbing forecasts here that go against exactly what you're saying we don't want. This war will at best conclude with Hamas's uprooting from Gaza and almost certainly its leaders' deaths. So far, good. But then it goes on. With an Israeli ground incursion into Gaza almost certain to be launched, it is difficult to imagine Hamas in the West Bank, because there's Hamas in Gaza, but there's also Hamas in the West Bank, which is the neighboring territory. Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's the northern border of Israel, and even radicalized Israeli Arabs remaining passive, because there are a lot of Arabs living in Israel, some very peacefully and getting along fine, some who are more radicalized who would respond to a ground incursion into Gaza in this way. He's saying it would be extremely tempting to all of those groups if there's boots on the ground, Israeli boots on the ground in Gaza. A regional war in which terrorists fire tens of thousands of rockets at Israel and Israeli forces fight on multiple fronts, quote, is a very real possibility. Iran might also exploit the chaos to further enrich its uranium stockpile and rush to make nuclear bombs. So that's, none of that is good. Is there any chance, and again, this is somebody who knows what he's talking about, former U.S. Israeli ambassador to the United States. Is there any chance, understanding those enormous risks, Israel doesn't pursue a ground incursion?
Honestly, I don't see how they can avoid it right now. There's no question that is a legitimate risk and one of my big fears, and why I say that we need to communicate diplomatically, very firmly to everybody in the region, not just threats, but diplomatically, like say, hey, nobody wins here. And if you guys get involved, we'll be forced to actually get involved as well. And it'll be bad for everybody. We cannot let this, expand. So we need to tell them that diplomatically. But these reports of babies being beheaded and civilians being mowed down with machine guns at a concert, I think the emotional component for Israel is just so high. I just don't see how Netanyahu can avoid actually sending the troops in, because he's basically already promised that's what he's going to do, that he's going to destroy Hamas. But wait,
let me ask you why. Let me ask you why, Colonel. Is it because there are hostages? If there weren't hostages, I realize they're still civilians, and we care about them, but given what's happened, I mean, all the rules of war have been broken already. But is it because of the hostages that we think there has to be a ground invasion?
No, it's not. I think that actually the hostages are working in the opposite direction, is what's making them hesitate go in. But it's just like our issue on 9/11, the emotions of seeing the Twin Towers fall, of seeing the Pentagon in flames. It's just so strong of an emotional pull that all of these civilians being killed. I mean, that's the Israeli version of that. Was, they see, that concert may have been the worst one, but there's many others. You had that one story there you just put on, and there's lots of others like it. Is that they, demand revenge. They demand retribution and justice for what's happened, and I just can't see the Netanyahu being passive for more than enough reasonable amount of time, because it's going to take time to get an offensive operation of this type set up and prepared and the people trained. As we talked about at the top, it's going to be hard.
But I don't get it, Colonel.
But
I don't
he
get it.
has
Why?
to
Because
do this.
Israel in about 2 days could bomb Gaza into smithereens. I mean, it could make it into one
Sure,
large parking lot,
they could,
without
but then they're going to be
ever
killing
sending troops in.
hundreds. But then they would be killing hundreds of thousands, probably, of innocent civilians, and they can't do that. They just can't do that, because then that would undercut their support probably around the world, and then harm their own interests.
I see. So
That's
you're
why I
saying
say this is so hard.
to take out Hamas, to end Hamas, it's going to require the army to be in Gaza, hand-to-hand combat.
I just don't see any way around it. I mean, the number of Hamas fighters is probably not that great. It's probably in single thousands, if even that. But there's 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip who are not Hamas and are just as terrified of what's going on as anybody else. But to get there, Hamas is, dug in. They're in the middle of all those people. They know that that's an inhibition for Israel, and they're counting on that. And they're unconcerned about the collateral damage that it would cause if they fight. But that's the conundrum that's weighing on Netanyahu. He has to weigh all of this, and there's just no good path. You have to say Hamas was good at setting a no-win situation up for Netanyahu, because he can't allow them to remain in power, and he can't allow them to just continue to live in the Gaza Strip. So something has to give.
So how would we most cleverly prevent Hezbollah from getting interested in joining this, prevent Iran from joining it any more than it reportedly may have? If we understand Israel's about to do this thing, which we understand and support, but will be provocative to those actors, how do we prevent it from becoming a more, a regional war?
Yeah, the one thing that's working in our favor is that Iran cares about Iran, and Iran cares about staying in power, and their leaders want to protect their regime above everything else. And that's the reason why that they have been very calculated in what they've been doing for years with the United States. They'll push a little bit, but then they won't push too far. When Qasem Soleimani was assassinated years ago, and they were vowing revenge or whatever, they were constrained by how far they could go, because they know that our ability to counterstrike dwarfs anything that they have. And that condition will still remain here. So they can't go too far, because they know we could take them out if it gets into an all-out fight, and they don't want that. So we can use that to restrict them. Same with the issue in the Hezbollah, though there's less control there, because they may also not care as much. They don't have a state to protect, so to speak, because Lebanon is actually its own state. So there's a bigger risk there, but you just have to do the best you can, and with no guarantees.
You mentioned that the raid at Entebbe, the kidnap, the hostages who were taken back then. This is a famous story, and it involves the sitting prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his brother. It happened back in 1976, where his brother, Jonathan, was killed during this daring mission to rescue, it was 106 Israelis at Entebbe Airport in Uganda after an aircraft hijacking by Palestinian-led gunmen. All but 4 of the hostages and Jonathan Netanyahu made it home alive. And there's just no question that Bibi Netanyahu is well familiar with the value of every life matters, every Israeli life matters, every American life matters. He's going to want to try to save the hostages. It's just a question of whether they can. And the barbarism of this group, which is matched in my experience only by like ISIS in recent memory. I haven't seen this kind of barbarism in my adult lifetime by any actor with whom, we don't have diplomatic relations with Hamas, but, we haven't been treating them like ISIS. Now we have no choice.
That's right. This appears to have been born out of desperation for the Hamas side and for the Palestinian side. But I think that history will show that they have overplayed their hand, because if they had any global sympathy, it's evaporating. And that's one of the other issues that I mentioned that Netanyahu has to be careful with. Is they can't do, as you suggested, some are talking about, of just leveling Gaza City, because then he would be doing even worse to the innocent people there. If he can keep all the focus on the Hamas brutality, and that Israel is doing its best to be professional and to defend its citizens and to get those back who've been captured, then they can continue to undercut the support for Hamas. And I think that's maybe where there's some room for Israel, and again, another reason why maybe some tactical patience might help. At least it's something to try. There's no obvious right answer. They got to try whatever they can, but Israel has to avoid, basically doing the same thing Hamas did and killing a lot of innocent people in the process of trying to get Hamas.
Israel's Air Force is much revered. They would certainly be the ones to go after Lebanon and after Hezbollah in Lebanon if they got involved. It's going to be trickier to just level Hamas for the reasons we discussed from the air. But there is an article in The Atlantic that was interesting about conscript. And here's their headline. They write, the Israeli military wasn't ready for this. I mean, no one was ready for this, but this is their take. They say Israel has an excellent Air Force and elite special ops unit, but its conventional line units, made up mostly of conscripts, are neither particularly well trained nor well disciplined, at least by American standards. They write, full-time professional militaries, like ours, of course, can dedicate themselves to rehearsing collective tasks that high-intensity combat situations often require, reacting to ambushes, conducting raids, incorporating artillery and air power into maneuvers. But conscript militaries, where you're forced to serve, everybody in Israel has to for a couple of years, by contrast, are forever bringing on and training new people. And then they go on to say discipline may be another issue. In 2006, Hezbollah was able to locate Israeli positions by intercepting Israeli reservists calling home on their mobile phones, meaning these are not professional soldiers. And so what we're about to ask of them, boy, it seems like a tall order.
Megan, you led into one of the key things I wanted to make sure we talk about today, and that is expectation management. So there's been lots of images of Merkava tanks driving around and howitzers, preparing, and armored vehicles. It looks like they're massing for an attack. And I think the assumption is, and the expectation, at least among many American viewers, is that there'll be this massive army that rolls in there and we'll be able to conquer, the enemy. But I cannot stress how difficult a large-scale operation of this nature is, and especially if you've never conducted one before as an institution, much less as the individuals, it is even more difficult than you can imagine. And we have recent experience with this. The Russian army had trained for 10 years in maneuver warfare before they launched into the Ukraine army. But once the bullets were real and they start flying, and it's no longer training but operations, you saw so many mistakes and so many avoidable errors that the Russian army committed that was just egregious. Likewise, you saw when the Ukrainian army this summer, when they launched their first offensive of a large scale into the Zaporizhia area, they too made so many mistakes, and they were just hammered because they didn't have the experience and the training on how to conduct those. Israel has never conducted an operation of this magnitude, of this type, to go into a city, more than just a small section here and there. They've never had to go into the whole area. So this is brand new for them. And as you pointed out, even at the individual level, they're not that well trained. So the casualties are going to be much, much higher, and it's going to be so much more difficult than anybody is imagining, even aside from the hostage issue. Once that's resolved, and if this gets into a conventional war, like with Bakhmut, it took 9 months for the Russian army to take Bakhmut, and you had like 70,000 or to 50,000 casualties on each side, and you're probably going to see something similar to that here among the Israeli side potentially.
Colonel, how vulnerable is the United States right now? We're shipping all this ammunition and arms to Ukraine. Now we're definitely going to help Israel out and with munitions at a minimum, but potentially more, as we pointed out, moving the aircraft carrier there and so on. We've got unprecedented numbers of people flooding across our southern border right now, which we know include known terrorists without any screening. It just kind of feels like we've gone from a secure place just a couple years ago to a less secure place now. But how less secure is my question.
And let me put some numbers on it. So I have been outspoken that we are giving away too much stuff to Ukraine. And it's understandable that you want to help them defend themselves. They were attacked. They were invaded. They have a foreign occupation army in their country. But our primary obligation is to Americans and to our national security. We have to date given over 5,000 military vehicles to Ukraine. And that's everything from tanks to armored personnel carriers to armored ambulances to resupply trucks. 5,000. Those were in our inventory in the event that we needed to. If we get into an unexpected fight, we've got to be able to sustain operations. 2 million of our shells have gone, of artillery shells have gone to Ukraine. 2 million of those things. We're producing at the rate of about 25,000 a month right now. It will take years to replace what's lost, but most of it's still going to Ukraine. And now then you're talking an additional 2 billion on top of the 3.8 billion that we always give Israel is now going there to include more rockets, air defense systems, etc. We can't keep giving all of these things away and it not have a negative impact on our ability, on our capacity to defend ourselves. And it's time. We're to the point now, not we're getting there. We are to the point where hard decisions are going to have to be made by our government. Are we going to continue to dissipate our own capacity so that if we have to get into a war, we'll have less ability to sustain and maintain that? Or are we going to keep just giving whatever either Israel and Ukraine want, no matter what, as long as it takes, is the phrase that keeps getting used. And I argue that that's not in American interest. And look, it's going to have negative implications for Ukraine, especially. But unfortunately, the combat realities on the ground say that this, if you keep giving stuff away, it's not going to change the outcome. So why do we need to keep diminishing our capacity for national security when it's not even going to change the outcome? And I think that we need to